My name's Andrew Sims. I work with an organisation called the New Economics Foundation. I write some books, and one of the books I've written is a book called Tescopoly, How One Shop Came Out on Top and Why It Matters, which is an account of the rise of the UK's largest supermarket, Tesco, and the impact it's had on life in Britain.
And do you know what's going on in Hay? We've got our own fight for Tesco's here at the moment, anti-Tesco's. What advice would you give us?
Well, I understand that the town of Hay is set to, or there has been an application from a supermarket to move into Hay. And what are some of the things that a town like Hay might expect if a major supermarket did open? Well, we've noticed over several decades and across the length and breadth of Britain that there are several major impacts that you need to look out for. First of all, supermarkets, the big national and international supermarkets, of which Tesco's is the UK's largest, I would argue need to be thought of as a kind of extractive industry. And what it is that they're extracting from communities is their wealth. They're designed as machines to maximise returns to remote investors, most of whom will never have visited the town where a new store opens. And what that does, in comparison to people spending their money in genuine local independent retail stores, is to mean that when you do go and shop, much less of your money, if you're shopping in a supermarket, will stay and recirculate and benefit other traders, other people, other businesses in that local town area. So the supermarket acts kind of like a giant vacuum cleaner, sucking wealth out of an area. Now, there's other things that happens when supermarkets come in because of the business model, because of one of the ways in which they save money, and one of the ways in which they lower costs are by pound for pound, in effect, employing fewer people to do the same amount of stuff. And the business models dictate other certain things, like the interactions that shopkeepers, people working in the shops, have with their customers, tend to be different, tend to be more constrained. So the way in which small independent businesses act like the sort of social glue that holds communities together, when your name is remembered and you find out, you exchange local information, that kind of thing doesn't tend to happen in supermarkets. And sometimes it goes even further than that. There's been studies done on the impact of the largest American retailer, Walmart, when it opens in a town. Even things like the number of people who go out to vote in elections goes down, because this social glue, the sense of community, is so corroded, is so undermined. So there's two impacts. First of all, the big superstore will act like a vacuum cleaner sucking wealth out of an area, and it would also begin to dissolve the social glue that holds communities together. Now, there's a third impact, I think, which is different but equally important. There's a way in which, over the last 2 or 3 decades, that the rise of the big retail chains, the chain stores, has been leaving us with a phenomenon that we've named Clone Town Britain. That's to say that if you walk along the main drag of a high street in towns north, south, east, west, it's increasingly likely that you could be almost anywhere, because you'll see the same shops selling the same goods the length and breadth of Britain. And what that does, of course, is to attack the very heart, the very identity, the sense of identity, the sense of place, the uniqueness, the distinctiveness that makes us feel good, potentially, about where we live. So there's a triple impact there: an economic impact, a social impact, and a cultural impact. And the worst thing is that once those big stores do open, the relentless way that the economics operate tends to mean it's a bit of a one-way street. It's very hard to roll back from that. So we think the kind of legislation, some of which you see in some states in America, and that you see on some parts of the continent, some of the local ordinance, the local rules that you get in countries like France and Italy, that restrict the number, the store size, or demand that impact assessments are done before, sort of multiple impact assessments are done before stores like that are ever allowed to to open are the sorts of things we should be doing in the UK. We should be weighing up whether there's a kind of a net benefit or a net cost to these kind of stores coming in. And also, honestly, we think it should be the decision, the democratic decision, of the majority of local people about whether or not these big stores are allowed to open. And there are pieces of legislation in the UK which are meant to put that kind of onus with at the community level. Things like the Sustainable Communities Bill, which allow local people to come together and, consulting amongst each other, come up with a plan for their area to have the most sustainable, in every sense of the word, solution for their local area.
Since when did supermarkets take the role, like in Hay, of building schools? I thought that's what we paid our taxes for. I'm a little bit confused. Has this been happening across the country?
One of the ways in which supermarkets tend to get their own way with the local authorities, and we have to remember that there's a very uneven relationship. It's a very uneven struggle between a giant supermarket and a local planning authority. So even if a local planning authority has its doubts, the fact that it might only fight one such major planning application over a number of years, where the big supermarkets are fighting them day in, day out, and they've got whole legal departments devoted to this they've got a whole they can marshal all these resources for things that the struggles that fights that they fight day in, day out almost. And so what happens is very often local authorities get worn down, and then they agree to things under so-called Section 106 agreements, where there's a sort of a trade-off, where in order for the supermarket to get its own way, a local authority might say, well, if you build us a playground or a school, or you provide some local amenity, which might in the short term seem superficially attractive to a local authority, but if what you're doing is for the long term effectively selling your local economy down the river to be at the whim of the decisions and choices of the remote institutional investors who, to whom the supermarkets dance to their tune, well then that's a very short-sighted decision. And even though it might seem that you might get a new little local asset, actually you're losing far more economically, socially and culturally. So very often it's a very high price to pay for a small asset that a supermarket might offer in return to being able to open a new store. Very often you'll hear the argument that supermarkets are a good thing because they'll give you cheap food. I think the idea that food can be cheap is always a myth, because if it appears cheap at the point of sale, it's usually because someone or something else is paying the cost. For example, one of the reasons that supermarkets are able to operate in the way that they do is because overall, net, they drive jobs out of the retail sector. One of the other things that they do through the way that they apply pressure down the supply chain is to undermine the livelihoods of producers and farmers and suppliers all along the supply chain. It's also a myth in a number of other ways, actually, in that if you would go to a typical open-air street market, it's very likely that you'll find fresh fruit and vegetables much cheaper than you would in a supermarket. And because of the complex and very clever ways in which supermarkets market, it's invariably the case that once you've gone into a supermarket, you end up spending more money than you ever intended to. Now, there's another thing about supermarkets and the model that they have, especially when they're focused on building large edge or out-of-town supermarkets, and that it's biased towards people who can afford to drive. It's all built around the idea of car ownership. And that's even before you get to the point of considering the major environmental costs of the huge infrastructures that the supermarkets depend upon, and the way that they're heavily dependent upon the high and volatile price of fossil fuels, road networks, international distribution networks, and the logistics of highly centralised systems also make them a very vulnerable basis upon which to build your food economy. So I would say, for a range of reasons, because a number of social and economic and environmental costs are hidden, and even from a straightforward point of view about what do you want in an economy if it's to work for people on low incomes, well, you want more jobs, not less jobs, and you want good and healthy food, and there's other ways in which those things can be got. So when a supermarket stands up and says, people like us because we offer cheap food, well, that's because someone or something else is paying the price.
Okay, but still, to people who are counting pennies in their pockets, and I know that the talk you did at Hay Festival, didn't the supermarket say, ultimately, it's the customers' actions. Customers come to us and they are the ones that say whether they want us or not because they come and use us. How would you answer that?
The idea that every new supermarket that opens is the result of customers calling for it is utterly spurious. In many, many occasions, exactly the opposite is true. I mean, I like to use the analogy of supermarkets become like a big piece of infrastructure over which people have had no choice about whether or not they open. But once they do open, because they are the infrastructure, well then obviously people use them. It's a bit like the fact that people use the M25 ring road round London. Now, they don't use it because they like it, they use it because it's there. And it doesn't mean there wouldn't be a better way of organising the transport system either. And the other point is that when they get to the point of market dominance, and they're able to achieve that market dominance by playing the legislative game, by using unfair competitive practices against smaller and medium-sized alternatives, that once they've got in that position, it's a little bit like, you know, if there's only one water pump left working in the centre of the village, well, of course people are going to go there because they're there. But if you believe in choice, in real choice, not just in choice of, you know, which of the 4 big supermarkets you're going to shop in, but what type of shops you want, what type of supply chain you want, well then we need the kind of legislation that prevents these kind of oligopolies, virtual monopolies in any given area from emerging, because then you get the ultimate paradox that flying under the flag of free markets and free choice, you actually end up with no free market and no free choice. But a bit like Henry Ford used to say when offering people a range of colours for the cars that he built at the beginning of the last century, you can have any colour as long as it's black. We'll end up in a situation where you'll be able to shop anywhere you like as long as it's Tesco.
Do we have a chance in Hay? Does Hay have a chance to beat something so big as a major supermarket chain?
Everybody has a chance. These things are never finished. They're never fixed. And if the current government is true to its word about putting more power, giving power to people in local areas, giving power to communities to decide for themselves what's best for them, then almost any other future is possible. I think what's important is, rather than maybe communities sitting and waiting for these shocks to come and leaving them with difficult struggles to fight, I think we should all be looking at our local area and deciding what kind of local economy do we want, and then engaging with the local authorities, using the legislation which is available to us to say, this is our vision for our town. And then when anything else comes along, you're in a position when you can say, well, we've already thought about what we want for our community, and we see it being like this. And if a big supermarket comes along and it's not part of that picture, well, then you can say, thank you very much, but no thanks. We don't need you here because we found a better way of meeting people's needs.
Okay, so can you give us any examples of where Tesco's has been beaten? Any villages or towns around England, Britain?
Well, there was a very good study. I mean, it's still an ongoing struggle, but there was a very interesting case study when you can see the benefits of, for a long period of time, not having had a supermarket move in. There was Saxmundham, for example, which actually unfortunately does now have a supermarket, but for a couple of decades it resisted the incursion of the big supermarkets, and a study was done for that period to compare it to other areas which had allowed supermarkets in. And what was stunning is that whereas in most most other areas, there'd been a dramatic loss in the range and diversity of independent retailers and producers and suppliers. In an area which had resisted the supermarkets, the opposite was the case. They had retained their richness and diversity of retailers and producers.